I'm not quite sure what the topic, I think some of you are not quite sure what the title means. Well, we're together, neither am I. When I accepted, Mr. Fairchild said, well, you know, you can say anything you want under that title. So let's begin talking about the general topic of the eclipse of reason, or at least try to see what kinds of issues arise. I think some of you know that in the 30s, many social scientists, philosophers, and publicists described that period as a period in which reason was eclipsed. What they had in mind, of course, was that there were a great number of irrational movements, or the fascist and Nazi movements, that were considered irrational in the sense that they defended irrational policies and irrational actions. And the title or the phrase, the eclipse of reason, was used optimistically. It was used by people to assert or to predict that this type of irrationalism would ultimately disappear and ultimately reason might triumph again. Whether their optimism was justified is not what I'm going to discuss tonight, although possibly that is what we ought to discuss. That is, whether reason really triumphed or a certain kind of force triumph which was identified with anti-irrationalism. Now, the distinction between anti-irrationalism and a defense of reason is roughly the following. That is, a great number of people who would have criticized the Nazis as irrational did not necessarily agree with certain kinds of programs that traditionally had been baptized as programs which defended reason or insisted that reason was sovereign or insisted that man was a rational animal. And theologians, people who had conservative ideologies, insisted that traditionally people had overemphasized the role of reason or the primacy of reason, and that actually a proper approach to life and to politics and a proper approach to correct interpretation of the nature of science or art requires that we minimize the role of reason or minimize our insistence or our description or our explanation of the role that reason plays in these areas. And that in that derivative sense, one might say that people felt that reason ought to be eclipsed, or at least one should not overemphasize its role. We hear the same today under various guises. Professor Isaiah Berlin has written a number of interesting and important essays and books on various people whom he considers or he describes as irrational, or people who defended the irrational. I think this is slightly misleading because when Professor Berlin describes them as defending the irrational, one might think that there's really this sort of wild people insisting upon the importance of yelling, screaming, just letting yourself go. It wasn't that at all, as Professor Berlin makes very clear in his writings. It was once again primarily a negative thesis as to the limitations of a certain kind of 18th century approach, or that which had been emphasized in the 18th century approach, the emphasis on reason. Professor Bell and Professor Lichtheim have taken over in America a view that was very popular in France in the 50s, that ideologies or the possibility of ideologies, the possibility of having an ideology is over. People in the 18th century might have felt that, once again, one blames the 18th century or describes the 18th century in that particular way, possibly for the sake of having some convenient place to begin. The proper description of the various thinkers in the 18th century is itself a very debatable point. What constitutes a proper description of their thinking is not very clear. But at any rate, once again, a great number of people have felt that people who had emphasized reason thought that one could get what vaguely is called an ideology, and people like Bell, Lichtheim in England and America, and various people in France insist, Raymond Aron, that one can't really have an ideology, and somehow all of this is related to some notion that reason has been overemphasized, and once again, if I can continue using this metaphor, that reason ought to be eclipsed. Now, what's involved here is very hard for me to describe clearly, not because I don't have enough time, because I'm not quite sure what it's all about. The easiest thing to say, and also the truest thing to say, is that there are a couple of interrelated issues and that one must distinguish them. And so let's try to begin by some simple, common, everyday phenomenon. Let's take three of them and then see what's involved here, and then we go and we'll generalize. Now, we all know that the word reason or reasonable is often used to describe a certain kind of method we might employ to influence people and to try to change their behavior. We might say we employ reason when we try to give them good reasons to change. Now, it's obvious to all of us that this particular method of trying to get people to change their behavior has its limitations. I mean, the proverbial case of a man running down the street with a gun, you don't expect policemen, presumably all the citizens are now yellow, so you have to have the policeman do it. You don't expect the policeman to go and to start reasoning with him. You expect to have him employ a certain kind of force, at least immediately. Well, this particular type of critique of the role of reason, that there are very many times that one can't be reasonable in this sense, one can't undertake to alter people's behavior by appealing to them rationally or giving them good reasons. Well, this, I think, is a commonplace, and it's extremely was well known, I suppose, to anyone who ever defended the role of reason, for a very simple reason, if you'll forgive it, because one could give good reasons, once again, when one shouldn't employ reason. There's nothing self-contradictory here or saying that reason has been eclipsed. One is simply saying that there are certain times in which reasoning is actually not to be undertaken, and a person who believes in reason isn't necessarily going to deny this because he can give good reasons when one shouldn't engage in a certain kind of dialogue. So this proverbial criticism is too commonplace, and I don't think was ever overlooked by anyone. The second thing about reason or its limits, which I think we all are aware of, and I simply mention it to get it out of the way, is the fact that we're all accustomed to circumstances in which we're convinced that certain things or certain patterns of action or a certain particular kind of an act is a certain kind of an act that we all ought to undertake, or, that we should undertake as individuals. And we might think that it's right, or the right thing to do is either to do something or to abstain or not to do something. And very, very frequently with all this thinking and involved, we do the opposite. We think it's the best thing is to stay home and we go. And this sort of thing about the particular kind of limitation of reason also is well known, and this is sort of a limitation of the causal role of reason. Traditionally, it was known under the freedom of the will, from St. Paul on. The good that we want to do, we do not. And the evil that we do not want to do, we do. Traditionally, this was not known necessarily under the notion of reason. This was simply known under the guise of the freedom of the will. We will certain things, and certainly and suddenly we find ourselves doing something else. And traditionally, it was once again described as the will is not free, in the sense that Hegel and Dewey's use of freedom, nice marriage here between St. Paul and Hegel and Dewey. Dewey and Hegel's sense of freedom, namely freedom having to do with power. We're free to do this, we can do this. The will isn't free, the will can't do certain things, or we can't do certain things we will to do. There is, as you very well know, an elaborate Christian interpretation of why we have this impotence of the will, which I suppose many of us would not accept. Well, at any rate, I'm not going to describe it. Now, once again, this is a commonplace observation, and therefore people who insisted that man is a rational animal, I merely want to say, once again, of course they knew this. I mean, it would be too silly or too obvious a point not to know, and if you think that traditionally people who said man are rational animals didn't know this, then, or that reason is sovereign, I presume you wouldn't give them credit for a certain amount of elementary common sense. What I think they had in mind, despite this, of course, is a simple thing, namely, at least let's take the 18th and 19th and 20th century version of the people who might have insisted on this, namely, that there are a number of causal factors at work, or if you wish, a certain kind of training or a certain kind of development, which might result in certain kinds of behavior patterns. And very, very often when we have certain kinds of control and other people don't, This control isn't, so to speak, it isn't, as it were, without any cause, without any background, and therefore reason in the sense of inquiry could discover these particular things, and if we want our actions to be controlled by reason, just taking the word glibly for the moment, namely, if we believe that a certain thing is the right thing, to have the power to be able to act on it, the fact that lots of people now don't have it is merely an indication that there's something to be discovered, and not necessarily an ultimate limitation of human power. Let me say in passing that a great deal of discussion, common sense discussion of this factor is obviously quite unclear. I mean, very often when we actually want to do certain things and we know it's the right thing and we don't do it, or we know the right thing is not to do it and we do it, very often in order to explain why it occurs, we simply baptize our ignorance by merely saying that, well, it's due to emotion or it's due to irrational factors. And we think we have an explanation when we appeal to this as due to either emotion or due to irrational factors, or factors beyond our control, or this emotion overcame our reason. In all of these particular things, all that we're doing is baptizing a certain kind of factor and thinking that we've explained it. That is, all that we know is that we haven't done that which we think is the reasonable thing, and we've baptized the factors that might be relevant by calling them irrational. But of course, on Freudian grounds, if one believes in the Freudian theory, then it's quite in harmony with this, what I call the secular view, or the inquiry view of the limitation of reason, namely that one could, by due investigation, find out why and how, why people don't have the power to act on what they consider reasonable, and once we discover it, might be able to have proper training to enable them to do it. As you all know, the Freudian theory is part and parcel of the same approach. If there are irrational factors which are controlling us, then presumably by a certain amount of either analysis or self or proper reading or proper approach with analysis, presumably some of these things could be discovered. So once again, the entire emphasis currently on the irrational, on the emotion, whatever, and obviously this merely indicates something which is, I'm merely giving a headline, a very complicated thing. Once again, I merely want to reiterate that this has very little to do, I think, with a critique of the traditional view about the sovereignty of reason, or that man actually is a rational animal. The notion of freedom, of course, comes in another way, and that's very often we say someone is free if by hypothesis he's not really acting in accord with let us say, a particular program, or if you wish, he's not following a particular kind of recipe. So that very often we say that an artist is free, a person in a factory isn't. Or we're really free if we're expressing ourselves. And when we really express ourselves freely, if we do what we want and we go along creatively, and we're not bogged down by, if you wish, routine or reason, then and then only can man reach a certain kind of height of self-expression and a certain type of contentment. This is a certain, if you wish, a certain kind of critique of reason of completely different sort, namely that actually one finds, if you wish, throughout lots of criticisms of contemporary life, that contemporary life is routinized, people follow routines, people who follow routines find their lives dull, and actually as a result of finding their lives dull, one must find a particular kind of other approach, and reason has become identified with routine, and the antithesis then is the so-called free creative act, either of the artist or the child, when the free creative act is the act in which presumably we accomplish certain things, and we do not, when we accomplish these particular things, once again follow a set pattern or a set ritual. Now, people who talk this way frequently also say that there's a limitation here on a particular kind or particular attempt that people traditionally undertook who defended reason, namely a particular kind of attempt to understand what makes or how human beings act. people, for example, who defended reason, although not all people who defended reason, also insisted that there's a certain kind of system that scientists might discover, relative to which they might be able to explain human actions. Very often people who insisted on this also insisted that people's actions are, so to speak, determined, and one can find general laws or rules relative to which, or accord to which, one could explain human behavior. Now, I think there's a great deal of, and possibly predict. Now, I think you will find two things here that are interrelated but obviously distinguished. One, a certain kind of thesis about what people really want. They, so to speak, really want to be free in the sense of not following routine. They don't want to follow rules. They want to sort of create at will. They want to play, as it were. Play in the best sense of play. This is one thing. Secondly, this is taken to be a limitation or a critique that presumably people had, that action is actually law-guided, or action could be described by law or predicted by law. If you look at some of William Barrett's things on the irrational, sometimes he identifies this kind of thing, the freedom of the artist, the creativity of the child, as not merely something which is desirable, but also something which presumably is shows the limitations of a certain kind of approach that people who defended reason had, system and emphasis on determinism. Now, taking the last point first, it's obviously a non sequitur. It's easy enough if a child does things which, and he, or it or she, is behaving in a way that the child is not following rules, it doesn't follow at all that a scientist looking at the child couldn't really give easy predictions as to the actual moves that children will make. Many children's books are replete with predictions of how the child will be actually creative. As far as the moral point is concerned, or the point, the word moral is, I think, too strong here. As far as the point about human psychology is concerned, what people really want, then I think it's harder to come to any interesting conclusion except the following simple one, namely that the whole dichotomy here seems misleading. People who play baseball very often come and do very creative things while they're playing baseball. And certainly it's rule-guided. The same thing comes out very often in comparison with cultures. Very often cultures are very often considered guided by rules, the primitive cultures, and then the advanced cultures are not. Well, actually, any primitive culture that, if you read the descriptions, most of the rules that they have governing their behavior allow for a great deal of latitude in terms for various kinds of actions. I mean, to take a very esoteric culture that I happen to have studied at one time, Orthodox Judaism, if there are certain kinds of rules as to how one actually prays, but within these rules there are all sorts of variations as to how one might lead a service, and this actually, for anyone who's involved, is a great, free, unpredictable act. From the outside, you might think it's all rule-guided, but believe me, it isn't. Moreover, it seems to me that if you look at Piaget's work and the work of other psychologists, I think one finds that it isn't at all true that there isn't actually in play behavior almost a drive to discover the rules. It doesn't seem to me at all correct to make this artificial dichotomy between, if you wish, complete rule-guided behavior and sort of free behavior. A good number of human actions, both of these things are interrelated in the various aspects involved. At any rate, completely routinized behavior is not identified with rule-guided behavior. And therefore, even if it's the fact that we don't want completely routinized behavior, it doesn't follow at all that we're not motivated to have rules and are guided by rules. Now, these things that I've merely suggested, I've merely thrown them out because I think if one looks at a great number of a good deal of the literature on the role of reason or the limitations of reason, one finds, I think, repeatedly emphases on these sorts of things. Either the emphasis that very often one can't engage simply in rational discussion, or secondly, that very often reason actually is limited in its causal efficacy, and third, reason becoming identified with the rational, and the rational with rule-guided behavior, and the critique therefore being that reason actually is limited because we don't want to have, once again, simply the routinized. The routinized becomes identified with rule-guided, and the complete antithesis between that and completely free and spontaneous. Things of this nature frequently indicated that have been used to indicate that reason has its limits. Now, as I said, the things that I've mentioned certain things which, as I don't think are false. The emphasis on the causal limits of reason, the lack of routinization, or the desire not to be routinized, all of these things I think are sort of elementary truths. The thing, however, is that the antithesis frequently is not clear, and a lot of these particular emphases are used against rules or the importance of rules, and I think don't really indicate or don't sufficiently take care of certain aspects of what's involved with the emphasis on reason and the role of reason, or what could be meant, or what historically had been meant by some people by the phrase reason and its limits. So let's begin again, keeping these things in mind, and begin on the notion of what could be meant by the fact that man is a rational animal, taking it for granted that he isn't always prudential, that this was well known. Well, one simple way of analyzing the phrase is simply that man, of all man, his distinguishing trait is that he can entertain concepts, or he can formulate concepts. He has reason, simply has a certain kind of, to use the phrase that psychologists frequently use, he has a certain kind of cognitive ability. And because he has this cognitive ability, namely to form concepts, as a result of being able to form concepts, he can be distinguished from all the other animals. Don't forget what's up here. There are a great number of traits that one could use to distinguish men from other animals. It's easy enough to say man's the only animal that has a newspaper. Man's the only animal that has a divorce court. There are a great number of things which men of the human community alone possesses. The emphasis on concepts is, however, easily enough explained. Presumably, all of these particular things presuppose the having of concepts. Unless men had concepts, then presumably he couldn't have these other things. So it wasn't that men alone have reason and there's no other distinguishing traits. There may be loads of other distinguishing traits. But it's not correct, according to tradition, to emphasize these other traits as much as emphasizing these particular things. This is one aspect. It's obviously not the only aspect. To emphasize, this is the beginning of a thesis in order to understand what man is like, to get a sense of what man is like with the emphasis on concepts. Now, currently a great number of philosophers and psychologists don't find this at all illuminating. Cassira, for example, thinks this is a mistake. One shouldn't emphasize the fact that man entertains concepts or can have concepts. I think a lot of you are familiar with the thesis of Cassira and Susan Langer. Man actually is a symbol-making animal, or man is a symbolizer. Now, this may be correct, but as an antithesis, but I find this quite unilluminating, and moreover, if one reads some of at least Susan Langer's emphases on what's involved here, a man being a symbolic animal, it actually comes down to actually something along the lines that, well, if you look at Philosophy No Key, it turns out that for man is distinguished from animals in the following way, that animals are actually sign behavior. That is, they can only take the occurrence of one event as evidence for the occurrence of another event. So that if it, take the proverbial case, if it gets dark, then the clouds get dark, they might think it rains, or the bell rings, they expect food. We're taking evidence as to be given ultimately a behavioral definition. They set themselves for food. But man isn't that way. He isn't necessarily restricted to this sort of behavior. He doesn't have to take certain kinds of events or the occurrence of certain kinds of events as evidence for other events. He's freer than that. He can take all sorts of occurrences and treat them in all sorts of ways, not necessarily as evidence for something else, but meaning something else, and it's a much broader sense of meaning. So, for example, if I uttered the sentence, "There's a man in this room," you don't necessarily have to take that particular sentence as evidence for anything else. You might, if I say there's a fire in this room, you might take my uttering of the sentence as evidence for the fact that there's going to be a fire. But very often you understand certain things without necessarily, and there's an event of utterance, and you understand the content of the utterance, but you don't take the event necessarily as evidence for the occurrence of another event. Now, how come we can do this? This is the emphasis on the symbolization process. Well, all that it comes down to, as far as I can see, as she put, that ultimately man can entertain concepts, and it's actually said explicitly. So that at least this emphasis that you find in certain areas of philosophy, or by certain philosophers and certain psychologists, on the distinction between signs and symbols, and the emphasis on symbol behavior rather than sign behavior. I'm not saying that there's no advance, but very often as you look at it, it's not clear to me at any rate that there's much of an advance over the traditional issue about man being an animal or an entity or that forms concepts. There are, however, more difficult problems involved, and that's whether it is correct to say that animals don't form concepts. And if one actually comes to the conclusion that there's no good reason to deny that animals form concepts, then actually this unique emphasis on man being a concept-forming animal might actually disappear. And I think there's a good deal of evidence, if you look at one might say at any rate, if you look at some of the behavior reported by animals, that there's no good reason to say that they don't have concepts. But it gets terribly complicated if one wants to have criteria that they have concepts. And if one looks for criteria in terms of certain kinds of utterances, as to what they would say, not merely what they do. Once you do that, then the problem disappears from the emphasis on concepts to whether or not the actual human beings that we have, the emphasis not so much, it's not clear whether to attribute to an animal having a concept, unless the animal, let's say, is, according to some people, can have certain kinds of apparatus, and especially linguistic apparatus, and as a result of having this linguistic apparatus, we can have certain criteria as to whether or not the animal does or doesn't have concepts. So we have today, I think, simply on this factor, the emphasis namely on the tradition, the critique, or at least it's an open issue, as to whether or not one could have a way of identifying men as making sure that men and men alone have concepts. And I think, roughly speaking, one could say that it seems intuitively clear, it seems clear to me, as to reading some of the literature and to others, that it makes perfectly good sense to say that animals have concepts. But if the issue becomes relatively complicated, either for certain kinds of concepts or to look for criteria for having concepts, to use a term that was popular as a result of the work of Wittgenstein, the emphasis shifts away from concepts to certain kind of linguistic behavior. And it's, as I say, there is a problem here, which I simply say I don't really know what the answer is, and as to whether one could emphasize concepts or make merely an aspect of degree, that there are certain kinds of concepts which men alone have and animals have others, and whether or not we can account for the degree in terms of language, or whether it's the other way around. It's because we can form certain complicated concepts, we then have a language. Now, I say all of this, as far as I can see, is up in the air, and it gets even more complicated if you ask for criteria or proof that certain animals or certain human beings have a certain kind of a concept. So this doesn't get us very far on the emphasis on concepts, whether man is to be distinguished from other animals in having concepts, or whether he's to be distinguished as a language animal or an animal that has a particular kind of or has acquired a language or is a linguistic animal, and just taking that for granted. Time's getting short, so I really don't think I could go into details as to the differences in emphasis on the American pragmatist approach on the language with Mead and Dewey and the sort of thing that one finds as a result of the work of Wittgenstein. Let me really say I've just indicated an area, concepts and language. Let's simply be a headline. And so that all of this indicates, as it were, is that there's a particular kind of approach in the tradition that we can get a hang on what man is really like by emphasizing his concept formation. We can get a necessary condition to account for lots of other things, but certainly won't be a sufficient condition to account for lots of other things. Merely the fact that man has concepts, you won't know why he published newspapers. But at least this was the beginning point. And whether this is at this stage of the game, whether this is an interesting beginning point or not, I merely would like to say I'm not sure. Related to this is, and currently more, I think, popular, at least popular, I think, in certain European psychologists and increasingly popular in a certain kind of American groups, with phenomenologists. There's a different kind of emphasis, and the emphasis is not so much that man is a concept-forming animal, but that man seeks significance, or if you wish, man seeks system. That man actually, to use another jargon, isn't stimulus-bound. That man traditionally merely finds a great number of things, and he isn't merely to be understood as reacting to specific stimuli. Now, a lot of this is overdone in terms of all sorts of analogies to mechanics, that he isn't simply a mechanical animal, he doesn't react mechanically, there's no mechanism involved. There are all sorts of irrelevant, or if you wish, not merely irrelevant, but all sorts of misleading way of describing this negatively. But the emphasis, once again, is that man, if you wish, is a system builder, or tries to find, when he has a series of elements which he experiences, tries actually to get certain kind of a particular kind of way of systematizing these particular elements, and to try to form a particular kind of system in terms of which he can understand, explain, and account or deal with all these particular kind of elements. Now, don't forget, people who talk this way actually using the word system in a systematically ambiguous way, that they are not saying, as presumably they're occasionally, as presumably some people have understood them to say, that the most important thing that man does is to try to get a system relative to which he can explain everything. That man, so to speak, is a rational animal in the sense that man is primarily interested in explanations, and that all the types of things that he has developed, all kinds of system of thought, let's say, to take a well-known example, for example, magic, that all the particular kinds of, that magic is merely a preliminary or prehistoric and crude way of doing science, that by engaging in magic men tried to understand the world, and he was doing bad science. Now, once again, you find a good deal of critique of the people who emphasize that man, if you wish, seek systems, seek significance. This is taken in certain circles as identical with the thesis that man is primarily seeking certain kinds of systems, namely systems relative to which he can explain and to give a systematic explanatory account of the world. This isn't the case at all, and the fact that men seek all sorts of systems or systematize a great deal, people who emphasize this are not at all saying that man are primarily interested in explanation. Now, this emphasis on system, and once again, I want to reiterate that this is systematically ambiguous. What it means to have a system in different areas, once again, would vary from context to context. What would be meant by a system in science, or a system in ethics, or a system in politics, that could be varied from case to case. Now, if you look at people like Levi-Strauss today, he emphasizes in many of his books that the growth of the intellect, in which he tries to account for certain kind of totemism in terms of what he calls the growth of the intellect. And he tries to show that attempts to explain or to explicate or to illuminate what's up in totemism, it will be completely will completely fail if one doesn't emphasize the drive for that the intellect is playing a role for itself, and I would simply drop the attempt the word intellect here and simply use the word that as an attempt to form a systematic way of dealing with animals and the relationship between animals and the groups, and there are certain kinds of principles that the groups had relative to which they classified and described the relationships between animals and the relationships between animals and themselves. Now this emphasis, which is current today in a great number, is an antithesis to certain things that occurred at the end of the 19th century, and Nietzsche, Dewey, and other people, in which presumably occasionally it's said that Marx said this, presumably what was up here, presumably according to some people, that these philosophers and psychologists and social scientists maintain that man really doesn't seek system except derivatively, that men undertake to solve particular kinds of problems, or men try to justify certain kinds of social practices, that ethical systems are primarily attempts to justify social practice, that the attempt to undertake to find systems of science are primarily attempts to sort of solve recurrent problems as to how to deal with the world. And there isn't really a drive for system. That isn't the case. What is the case, however, is that men have certain other kinds of needs, to use once again the jargon, non-cognitive needs. They want to control the environment. They want to find ways of justifying the current political setup. And all these other, and lots of these so-called intellectual constructions and systems are actually to be understood merely, as it were, as attempts to do that, and there is, so to speak, no particular kind of, if you wish, native disposition that people have to systematically understand and to explain or systematically deal with their emotions or to deal with their tribes, etc. Now, I find this discussion, which is recurrent, very perplexing. First of all, it's very hard to know on the grounds that on a glib or a naive or a very simple-minded Marxist or Deweyite line, which Dewey never really held, and a vulgar Dewey line and a vulgar Marxist line, why we do find this recurrent need to justify. Actually, there isn't you can't merely say that men use systems in order to justify. You also have to explain how come there was ever an attempt or ever the drive to look for a system in the first place, even if you use the system in order to justify. Secondly, if one looks at it, once again, a great deal of animal behavior, it seems that a good deal of animal behavior, once again, seems to be motivated just to find out what's true in the environment. There's some experimental studies in which animals very often will give up a certain amount of food just to be able to explore the environment, a certain curiosity drive. So, I mean, this is simply a certain kind of evidence. It's not exhaustive. But it seems to me that the particular kind of emphasis on the fact that people don't really seek systems and that systems are only derivative and are there merely to satisfy other motives and other needs, it seems to me an over-exaggeration. I can simply refer you to some of the literature. Now, there's a very interesting thing that's just come out by Mel Spiro on the attempts to give an explanation of primitive religion. It's a series edited in England on anthropology. It's and one of the book is called Anthropology and Religion, and there's a very interesting essay by Mel Spiro, an anthropologist, on various attempts to explain kinds of religious practices and beliefs that groups had, and he uses a good deal of psychological and ethnographic material, I think, to show the limitations of views that, if you wish, the functional view, that there isn't, if you wish, an attempt to understand and explain. Now, don't forget, I'm not saying, I don't think anyone has ever said, that man only looks for system for its own sake. It's merely the other way around, whether there's an independent drive. And although this is something which I can't prove or give evidence, it seems to me that it is the case that there is. But now we have a number of issues just beginning, and this is where it begins. Let's say men either want system for their own sake or want system for some other reason. The question then comes up, could this particular quest for system be satisfied? If one doesn't have this particular quest for system, if it can't be satisfied, what are the limitations? You see, very often in Berlin, for example, by the notion of system, Berlin very often seems, when he talks about political system, he actually relates it to what may be called ethical systems. And very often what he seems to want by an ethical system is sort of a set of principles so that, given these set of principles, we will always be able to decide any outcome that we have to encounter. And if we can find that we can't get such principles, by reference to which we could actually decide what to do for any particular occurrence, then presumably this is a limitation of the drive for system. Well, obviously, let's say we can show that this will not be done. What then has to, for example, it's quite clear that most of us, let's not take a moral issue for the moment, let's take simple issues of preference. Very often, given our preferences are such that when presented between the option for a piece of cake and a piece of ice cream, we very often won't know what to do. We might be indifferent between them, and our system, quote unquote, of preferences might not dictate any outcome. In this particular case, there's actually, if you wish, no big deal involved. So what has to be shown is the following: even if one can't get a system, in the sense that Berlin seemingly wants, that there may be conflicts occasionally between principles, one has to show, A, that this is a great law, so we might say, well, it isn't really such a tremendous loss. Why should you necessarily be able to decide every outcome? And secondly, even if one shows that it isn't the case that we have these kinds of principles, one must be able to show what is the alternative. That is, let me simply use a vague word. There may be a structure that we have of moral principles or moral preferences, which is analogous to the structure we have of non-moral preferences. And to be sure, our preferences are such that they don't dictate every outcome. But to go from that to say that we don't have a system, or that everything goes about our preferences, or everything goes to be said about our preferences, seems to me quite misleading. So let me really, on this particular point now, say the following, that it may very well be that men have a drive for system. It may very well be that this drive may not be satisfied. Berlin and others might show that the drive isn't satisfied in certain areas, for example, in morals. Very often what's up here is a particular kind of severe restriction on the question of system. The restriction, namely, in relationship to unique outcomes, that we may not be able to have it. But even if we don't have it, there are two things that have to be substituted: show what actually is involved in how bad is it, as it were, that we don't, how much are we losing, and secondly, what actually is the structure that we do have. And one of the things I find limiting or not too illuminating on some of the people who deny the so-called system, or we don't have a complete system of ethics, is that they don't really try even to undertake to analyze the type of structure we do have. I once, in a joke, semi-joke, asked the class to write an essay on the following: that there really isn't any real moral conflict, because it's either a choice between the good and the bad, and then it's obvious that you do the good, or it's a choice between the bad and the bad, and then it's obvious you do neither, or it's a choice between the good and the good, so what's the difference? Anything you do is good. Now, in a way, Berlin occasionally shows that very often we seem to be in conflict between two goods, and we can't choose between these two goods, and he seemingly comes to the conclusion that this, so to speak, actually something great is tottering. Now, it may very well be that nothing is tottering. It may be that there's nothing more upsetting than the fact that on our system of non-moral preferences, we often can't decide except by flipping a coin, whether to have, or mentally flipping a coin, whether or not to choose between, once again, cake and ice cream. Now, I began with ethics simply as an example, but obviously one has to go from case to case. the issue as to whether or not one can get a metaphysical system, whether one can get a system in aesthetics, whether one can get a system in science, and ultimately a system in politics, which is the issue of ideology today. I think a good deal of the history of modern philosophy is an attempt to see whether or not one can undertake and to find out, to analyze whether or not one could get certain kinds of systems in various areas, and if not systems, even isolated propositions that we might consider true or false. It is occasionally said, whether this is a correct way of putting Kant's point is something which is not for me to say. Professor Parsons is in the audience, and I'll ask him to talk about this, that one of the ways that people frequently discuss Kant is that Kant's main point, and once again I don't think this is accurate, but at least it's been said on occasion, is that men actually can only form systems about things that they encounter. That is, the content, to be sure they may have certain kinds of formal principles, but if they try to get systems of thought or even isolated propositions, much less whether the propositions are systematically interrelated, of things that they don't encounter, that is, things beyond space and time, let's put it glibly that way, they'll inevitably fail. That men actually might have certain kinds of formal principles which they don't derive from experience, but actually these formal principles have to have certain kinds of content and have to feed on content. And if to try to get a system about things which are not encountered, one actually will inevitably fail. To a great number of people, this was, once again, a great presumed crisis. To some people, Kant was the great destroyer. Now, if this is Kant's point, if this is Kant's point, it seems to me quite debatable, because if it means that for any given concept that we have in any science, the particular kind of concept must be a concept that, which has instances among about that which we've encountered. If it's that strong, then it seems to me false. I mean, just taking a well-known example in certain esoteric circles, various issues about spin and other things in subatomic particles. These are not things which are encountered in the things that we ordinarily have. But once again, let's say for the sake of argument that Kant, or a Kantian sort of position, is correct. Then once again, this doesn't indicate necessarily that reason has been eclipsed. It's simply a question of discovery of what actually men can do, and discovery what we should reasonably look for. There's an analog to a Kantian point, which is not really Kant's point, but there's an analog to this, which I'd like to mention. There are a great number of people who have discovered the obvious point that a great number of our beliefs and even our perceptions are to be accounted for in terms of that which we've encountered. And there may be causal factors at work in relationship to our beliefs as to how the world is actually constituted. Given this particular kind of belief, a great number of people say, I mean, this particular kind of evidence, then people very frequently come to the conclusion that there's a great problem for justification. If our perceptions about the world are to be are socially influenced, if people who come from a certain environment see the world this way, and other people who come from another environment see the world this way, then, my God, there's a real problem of justification. What's right? Now, I merely want to say that if this thesis depends on the fact that if our beliefs or our perceptions are caused, then we cannot be in the position of justifying various sentences about that which we perceive. Then the mere fact that we have eyes or brains should create the difficulty, not the fact that we come from social and that we might be influenced by our parents or by our neighbor. Because obviously there are causal factors at work all the way down, even on the fact that I see this as a microphone. Well, I started out, it's taking longer than I anticipated. I started out by trying to say that, I'd like to, if I can, go on a few more minutes. I started out by trying to say that there are 3 or 4 kinds of recurrent phenomena that we all encounter, the phenomena in which either very often we can't actually always deal with people in a reasonable way, the fact that reason may be impotent, the fact that very often we might think that not following rules is actually the thing that's crucial and for human creativity, that these things have very frequently been given as emphases on or reasons to believe that traditional views of the nature of man and the emphasis on reason are incorrect. I just mentioned those, and it didn't seem to me that these particular things were overwhelming. I then turned to the other issue, trying to sort of indicate certain aspects, and these are just the beginning point, certain aspects of the issue of reason, the one view of the nature of man being a rational animal, and went from the notion of concepts to the notion of system. Now, thus far I've been able to deal only with 2 or 3 aspects of these whole issues, namely whether man is concept animal or a seek system, and I kept on warning that there are particular kind of that one has to define word system in a number of ways, and I merely hinted that very often some reasons have been given that man's quest for system failed, and as a result of man's quest for system failing, people have very frequently come to the conclusion that reason is limited. And I merely wanted to say that it may very well be that the quest for these kinds of system failed, but it doesn't follow at all that man is therefore limited, because we might have extremely good reasons for not looking for systems in that nature. Now, had I had more time, I really would have spoken about what I take to be very misleading aspects of the growth of the misleading analyses of limitations of attempts to find systems in science and various kinds of misleading things. But in the few minutes remaining, I'd like to try to deal with some issues more detailed vis-a-vis ideology. Now, because I think a lot of the things actually come involved here. When one deals with ideology, the question is, lots of issues are raised about ideological factors, and I think currently Bell and others have emphasized that we may not be able to get an ideology, and this indicates that reason, once again, is tottering, because a certain quest for system is tottering. Now, what may be meant by the word ideology? As far as I can tell, what's up here is something along the following lines, that a group has an ideology if it has a series of ends, if it specifies certain kinds of ends, and there's an agreement on the ends. Secondly, it assumes that it has a series of statements about the means as to how to accomplish the ends, or has a particular kind of apparatus available to enable them to know what means to use in order to get these ends. Thirdly, that these are the particular ends that they emphasize are ends which presumably are going to be relevant for every kind of at least every kind of major social problem that is encountered in a society. And fourthly, the use of these particular ends and the means to accomplish those ends would not be self-defeating. So that by having these particular kinds of ends, to accomplish certain kinds of these means, to accomplish certain of the ends, we will not also come to the conclusion that we will necessarily come to the conclusion that we will get something we don't want. Now, presumably, when people talk about Marxists having an ideology, I think something along these lines was meant. The particular kind of issue, therefore, is that we have a certain kind of a system, an issue interrelating means, ends. Sometimes it's put, it has to be total. If you wish, instead of saying total, it would be relevant for every kind of recurrent major social or possibly even minor problem that society might have. Now, Bell and others have now come to the conclusion that we can't have an ideology, or it's a mistake to have an ideology. And if you look at them, they frequently then draw the conclusion that a drive to find system or theory in political science or in politics therefore fails. I merely want to indicate that even if you don't have an ideology in this particular strong sense, it doesn't follow that you can't have all sorts of derivative kinds of theories and less strong kinds of theories or approaches to politics, which might be guiding principles. And the fact that you can't have an ideology in this strong sense doesn't show, as Bell occasionally says, that therefore now political ideas are exhausted, as he frequently seems to say. On the other hand, people, now to go with ideology all the way down, I think one would have to also see the reasons Bell and others give for why you can't have an ideology. Sometimes Bell and others simply insist you can't have an ideology because there's no real way of justifying the ends. Occasionally people talk, like more recently people talk, you can't really justify an ideology because you can't have independent scientific agreement upon the means. Even social scientists who are, so to speak, neutral will frequently disagree about what actually is a correct or well-justified or well-confirmed social scientific theory. It's not the case, as presumably it is the case in physics, where we can have objective agreement on whether or not a certain thing is or is not the case, or whether or not one could or could not use a certain means to accomplish a certain end. So that there have been all sorts of arguments given that man actually is not in the position of having an ideology. Now, since time is short, I immediately would like to say that most of these arguments seem to me completely wrong, all the way down the line, and it seems to me that there are ways of justifying ends which are relevant for politics, presumably if one is involved in the issue of moral justification that Bell raises. See, the whole issue is involved, presumably the issue of ideology, the issue is raised on a moral ground, not simply an issue of interest. And if it's and Bell very often vacillates between the issue of justifying ends, that you can't justify ends in politics, with another issue, to wit that very often, instead of trying to justify ends which one considers morally justified ends, one simply in politics actually is involved with defending interests. To justify a political end, I say I think one can, I was too quick. But even if one can't decide this simply on the basis of the fact that very often in politics, issues of interest are aroused rather than ends. Now, wait a minute. I don't want to quit when I'm behind. The point I'm trying to make, and even I'm not, I think if I haven't succeeded, I'm sorry. The point I'm trying to make is the following: that we frequently find in various writings about the role of reason a correct emphasis on the fact that people traditionally have sought systems. You frequently find then that certain very strong requirements are put on, or certain kinds of strong requirements are put on as to what would constitute an acceptable system in a certain place. You frequently find, and recently in issues of ideology, discussion of ideology, with these strong restrictions, very often these systems, or systems of this sort, might not be able to be discovered. From this, people then frequently come to the conclusion, and simply leave it at the point, well, you see, reason is tottering, or there's an irrational factor, or political ideas are exhausted. And there are 2 points I'd like to close on. One, this seems to me to end where one should begin. One should begin on this particular point of trying to see what's the surrogate, or what's the analog, or what's the substitute for these strong systems in the strong sense. And the second point I want to say is, why is all this important? I think all this is important because if you look at a great deal of literature, there's a split very often in the literature that we find. Very often, on the one hand, we find this emphasis on system in the writings of certain people, and then in the other part, you very frequently, either you find other writers, or the same writers in other of their, in other sections of their work, completely forgetting about the strive for system, or the attempt to get a systematic set of principles, and do their work on a completely, if you wish, intersubjective basis. A man is to be only understood, either in terms of, even Lang, for example, take Lang's book on the divide itself, which is a very illuminating book very often. But what you find then is the whole approach is that man is primarily to be understood as a social animal in the sense that he's trying to get proper relations with his fellow man. And then you have all sorts of permutations and combinations in that theme. If he doesn't get if he gets good relations with other men, he can grow and be rich and creative. If he can't, then he can have either one of two things. He can either become other-dependent or self-dependent, and the dialogue and the dialectic is put in that particular way. If you wish to use language that's reminiscent of Buber, man is primarily to be looking for I-thou relations and things of that nature. Now, I think that this is completely misleading and wrong psychologically. And the emphasis on system is important because it seems to me that recurrently man has looked for things which are impersonal and which cut across various personal and psychological issues. And if I can sort of moralize at the last point, unless one finds agreement on lots of systematically leading on principles which are systematic and interpersonal, then a good number of so-called personal relations will inevitably fail. And it's not necessarily the case that man simply is questing for I-thou relations, and I take it for granted that we are. And not merely that man is a social animal, I also take it for granted that we are. But that our social aspect and our being human together also presupposes that we're involved in a quest to find something which cuts across you, me, and between which we can all collectively share. Phenomenologically, of course, it then leads to the view that there's something objective out there and that we are dependent on it. But whatever the phenomenology of it is, I think this quest for system, this quest for understanding, the quest to try to find a coherent set of principles, which is a recurrent aspect of man, we frequently fail, and we certainly, it's easy to show we will fail if we'll put strong requirements on it, but some of the literature recently has won easy victories, and some of the literature has obviously been misleading because it's even failed to emphasize it. Thank you.